Well, if this is the Corbyn revolution, then this is what it looks like. A Labour Party sharply divided, despite an attempt by the new leadership to talk the language of unity. From the absence of women in leading positions and the absence, too, of most of the party's big guns, Labour's open wounds have been all too visible. Mr Corbyn has promised a strong combination of change and continuity. But can he hold it together? In our first report tonight, here's our political editor, Gary Gibbon.
Hello. Good afternoon, sir.
Afternoon.
Are you disappointed so many people have left your team before you've even started?
We've got a great team. Majority of women in the shadow cabinet for the first time in history. It's a great team, fantastic.
Jeremy Corbyn was asked why he didn't have women in his top jobs.
Who decides what's the top team?
Jeremy Corbyn said he had 16 women to 15 men in his new team and people from right across the Labour Party. Andy Burnham, who he beat into a distant second place, agreed to join the team. The other two candidates joined 10 other prominent frontbenchers who decided they couldn't work with Jeremy Corbyn. This man can. John McDonnell is his choice as Shadow Chancellor. He's Jeremy Corbyn's political soulmate, inseparable rebels through the years. He's called for the overthrow of capitalism in the past, praised IRA bombers for their sacrifice. At last week's close of campaign rally, he acknowledged his Westminster fan club wasn't very big.
When he had his celebration of his 30 years in Parliament, I said, look, Jeremy's my closest friend in Parliament. My wife is here, said he's your only friend in Parliament.
Jeremy has to show that the inmates haven't taken over the asylum, and I'm afraid that the appointment of John McDonnell to Shadow Chancellor does suggest that that things aren't going quite right.
There's a bicycle there behind you, be careful.
Jeremy Corbyn's team's asked him to keep off his bike a bit for safety reasons. Delivering on his campaign pledges will also be perilous in a shadow cabinet where he's potentially outnumbered in many issues. On welfare reform, those who most wanted Labour to abstain on the government's reforms seem to have left the front bench, so Jeremy Corbyn's got some room for manoeuvre there. On anti-austerity measures, expect the government to put pressure on Labour's centrists to try and pull away from Jeremy Corbyn. On Trident, he may try and get the conference to vote his way, abandoning the Trident nuclear missile. But trade unions concerned about jobs could link up with the centre-right and confound him there. On Syria, a vote that could come quite soon. There's no way Jeremy Corbyn wants to back military involvement, but some of his shadow cabinet might well. He may have to let them have a free vote. If what happens is that you have a shadow cabinet that's so divided it can't actually come to a view on something, and you end up going your different ways, free votes, isn't there a risk that might look a bit of a shambles?
Well, let's see. I mean, this is a new terrain for many of us, and there is a spirit there which I think over the summer really came to life, which is that I do think the public are fed up of us all looking like we're saying things we don't necessarily or agree or believe in. So,
but they might not like you all saying different things.
Absolutely, and this is the fine balance.
Jeremy Corbyn sat on the front bench for the first time today in the trade union reform debate to emphasise his opposition to the government's changes. On Wednesday, voters will see his very different approach to the Commons bear pit.
I don't think the public are actually very pleased when they just hear MPs shouting at each other and sort of making animal noises across the chamber. It's all great fun and jolly japes when you're in there, but it doesn't actually mean anything to people that really look to their politicians to do something about their housing problems, their job problems, their poverty.
Celebrating with campaigners on Saturday, Jeremy Corbyn paid tribute to his mentor, Tony Benn, who died last year.
Yesterday I attended the interment of the ashes of my old friend Tony Benn, and I just kept thinking, what would Tony think of this extraordinary turn of events? And I don't know the answer to that. I think publicly he'd be overjoyed. In private, you might have been able to get him to admit that it's a high-risk strategy.
That is certainly the Conservative view, made clear in an attack video released online today.
Well, now there are a few hundred people now inside this hall. There are a few people still arriving, and they're coming here for a People's Assembly meeting, an anti-Tory rally. And they obviously want to hear Mr Corbyn, who will be here later. Well, earlier I spoke to the new Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell, about everything from his stance toward the IRA to colleagues who aren't exactly his best friends. But I began by asking about his hobbies in Who's Who, where fomenting the overthrow of capitalism is listed.
The emphasis is on ferment, which was about brewing, but there you are.
Well, what does brewing mean? I mean, in terms of capitalism.
Well, it means actually ensuring that people understand what capitalism is and we talk together about how we change it, because it's failing people at the moment.
Change or overthrow?
I think you change to a gradual process. That's what socialism is all about. But at the end of the day, I do want to transform it.
Is it actually the Shadow Chancellor's role to try to reform capitalism?
Yes, it is. I think the Shadow Chancellor's role is to put forward an alternative to what's happening at the moment. And what's happening at the moment is that under our economic system that we've got with people in poverty, we've got 4 million children in poverty at the moment in our country, 2 million pensioners, and that's just unacceptable in a civilised society.
We know what poverty is, we know what wealth is, but where is the point at which you say, right, those are people who need to be taxed more? I mean, what sort of earnings are you talking about?
Yeah, see, I'm not particularly interested in tax on income. What I'm concerned about at the moment is the organisations that are walking away, well, literally laughing to the bank, are those that are not paying their taxes.
A lot of this will be about trust, after all.
Yes.
The last Labour government left Britain with the worst deficit since the Second World War. And establishing trust is difficult. I mean, in your case, for example, if we take something like what you've said about the IRA, people will find that very hard to understand. Why would one honour the IRA and their guns and bullets, to quote you?
Yeah, that needs explaining quite a bit, and I'll do it briefly if you don't mind. This was 13 years ago, at a time when the peace process was extremely fragile. Some of us had to go out and sell that peace process. And we were worried at that stage that if elements within the IRA, the Republican movement, thought they were going to be humiliated and defeated, there would be a major split. And in that way, the bombings and the military campaign would continue on. So some of us had to go out there, I might not have chosen the right words, but actually explain to them that they could stand down with dignity. They weren't being defeated, they were standing down, they could put their weapons aside. And I was saying that to both sides. Now I know as a result of that, I got attacked, but actually it worked. And if it saved one life, it was worth it.
Are you surprised that people are somewhat queasy about your appointment?
Oh no, not at all. Why shouldn't they be? I'm a backbencher. I've been opposed to virtually everything New Labour has done. I've been voting against them on many things like privatisation in Iraq and things like that.
How would you describe yourself? Because why is it that your colleagues, so many of your colleagues, seem to think that you're so far out as to be unfit to be Chancellor, effectively?
It's because in this place I've had to oppose a lot of things, and sometimes that's meant swimming against the stream, and that has meant Jeremy and I at times have been isolated, but actually we were right on many of these. We were right on Iraq. We were right to vote against the privatisations. We were right to vote against the cuts that even New Labour introduced to benefits. So I think we've been proven right, and I think the tide is now with us.
You see, Hilary Benn, who after all is now the Shadow Foreign Secretary, said that Labour will work for a yes result,
Jeremy is
staying in Europe.
Yeah, but Jeremy has said that, but there will be something...
And do you say that?
Well, I do, but... so
you can bring yourself to vote for Europe.
Well, what we're asking for is a significantly reformed Europe. We want our own reform agenda. We're going to meet with socialist parties right the way across Europe to look at that reform agenda. But there will be members of the Parliamentary Labour Party who are campaigning now for knowing that referendum. You've got to respect their views.
How do you feel about the fact that a woman doesn't have your job?
Well, we've now announced the Shadow Cabinet. It's 16 women and 15 men. That's a historic breakthrough. I've heard all this thing about none of the 4 top jobs are occupied by women. Jeremy has said quite clearly there's no top jobs. That's archaic. It's like something from the 19th century when government only invaded places or just had a police force or managed a small budget. Now the real jobs, I think, are about the delivery of services like health and education. And all those key jobs, there are women.
For many of the issues that you've pursued, the media have been hardly, there, but they're now very there. How do you feel about the way you and Jeremy Corbyn have been treated in the last couple of months?
We've managed to break through to have a proper political debate, but largely as a result of the public meetings we've held and the social media. Years ago, we never had Twitter, we never had emailers on this scale, we never had websites. Now we've created our own media, and that's enabled a better political debate. Some of the media have done their usual thing, they've personalised it, etc. I have to say, Jeremy and his family, I just have to pay tribute to them. So the attacks that they've had, and they've held together extremely well. And I'm sure that's what they'll be doing to me as well. And we'll just have to keep our heads up, chin up, and continue on. But keep on drawing people back to the political debate. And to be frank, the political debate that we've had over the last 3 months as part of the leadership campaign has just stimulated. It's just been phenomenal. You know, when did we last see 1,000 people turning up at a public meeting and still banging at the door wanting to get in? I just think it's tremendous.
Finally, will the system allow you to survive? Do you want to survive? Do you want to do 5 years? Do you want to be Chancellor of the Exchequer?
Oh yes, this is a serious endeavour to go back into government. But we'll only go back into government if we ensure that people have confidence in us in managing the economy. That's why we're putting forward a very concrete alternative. I want to give people confidence that we can manage the economy better than any other political party, but we can manage it in the interests of ordinary working people, middle and low earners, so that actually, yes, we are ensuring that they have a prosperous future. But we need to do that on the basis of real democratic engagement. We've done that during this campaign. I want to maintain that momentum.
Well, John McDonnell's appointment was a strong signal that Jeremy Corbyn's brand of economic policy is now firmly ensconced at Labour's heart. That means a crackdown on corporate tax avoidance, a powerful new economics ministry, and more, as our economics editor Paul Mason now explains.
Just in case they needed a reminder, Labour's new leaders came to their first day at Party HQ to find this outside their window. Workers building stuff amid an economic recovery under the Conservatives. Inside, as the photographers hovered, the biggest change in economic policy Labour's ever witnessed got underway.
Please welcome John McDonnell.
Even when Labour was left-wing, its chancellors and shadow chancellors have tended to be moderate. With John McDonnell, those days are gone. But what will he actually do? One economist influential in the Corbyn camp spells it out.
So one of the things you want to get on top of is whittle away at the Treasury. Stop it being this all-powerful, all-important department that oversees every other part of economic policy, and probably do something like beef up the Department for Business so it's much more able to take a lead in setting what economic policy is like. It can intervene, it has an understanding of what's going on, and it can challenge the Treasury when needed.
That would leave the Treasury to do two things: design a new high tax regime and set an enhanced remit for the Bank of England. In a break with both Blair, Brown and Cameron, the central bank would then be tasked with using monetary policy to boost growth and reduce debt. You could even go back to ministers, not the bank, setting interest rates, as happened as late as 1997 under the Tories. It is this change in power and priorities that's already wowed the unions, but the leader of the TUC in Brighton had this warning.
My message to Labour is this: look sharp, pull together and do what working people are crying out for Her Majesty's opposition to do: get stuck in and oppose.
For centre-right economics, the past 48 hours have been surreal.
I think the most important problem is that it's unrealistic, whether it's in tax policy. For example, they're suggesting that they're going to raise huge amounts of revenue, la-la land figures on tax revenue, but also there are contradictions, whether it's in housing or energy. On one hand, they want to ban domestic gas, but also reopen coal mines. They want to ban right to buy, but extend right to buy for private tenants. So it's a mixture of those things which make it quite a dangerous cocktail.
But the excitement and the apprehension are about more than just policy. This is about a whole generation of modernisers defenestrated. This formula of a strong economic ministry, a weak treasury and a politicised Bank of England is, in economics terms, not particularly radical. What makes it radical is the same thing that's brought the world's press to Labour's door. For the first time in 80 years, the establishment does not control the Labour Party.
Let's just keep moving, please. Thank you, everyone.
For the deep detail and design, we may have to wait. You could fit the team running the Labour Party's economic policy right now into a people carrier with room to spare.
Well, our economics editor Paul Mason joins us live now. Paul, what do you make of day one of the revolution?
Well, it has been chaotic, John. In terms of revolutions, this has been like one of those moments where, as in 1989 in East Europe, protesters storm the TV station and it carries on rolling. Because over the weekend we saw those scenes of Jeremy Corbyn being elected. What has happened today is they've moved into Labour HQ, they've started to try and make it work.
Labour HQ was already very denuded of people after Ed Miliband's departure. But the real problem Corbyn has is that beyond him, McDonnell and a few people such as that you saw in my package there, that there is very little strength in depth in terms of policy making and execution. And as anybody involved in politics will tell you, even in opposition, it is a grueling business requiring tens of young graduates who spent their entire lives preparing to do it. Almost everybody involved with Corbyn has spent their entire life preparing to do this behind us, wear a bib, organise rallies and do demos.
Well, what is there left now of the old Labour apparatus?
Obviously, it's the apparatus, it's the old front bench. Obviously, we've heard, again, the narrative of we're not playing, we're taking a back seat. I'm hearing, especially from outside London, where people tend to be a little bit more open with their own constituency parties, several of those front benchers, former front benchers, are effectively saying this is an 18-month interregnum. We will be back. There will be regime change before 2020. And I think it's...
They don't like the voices of the 250,000 people who voted for it.
Well, they're thinking about the several millions of people who deserted Labour for the UKIP and the Greens. And even the TUC today, as you saw in my package, are concerned about the potential of this group to win an election.
Great. Well, now, what's going on behind me here is a People's Assembly. That is a kind of protest group that's been mustered around anti-Tory activity. It's going to be addressed by Jeremy Corbyn in a moment and by Yanis Varoufakis. And that, of course, is causing great excitement. For more in-depth coverage of Jeremy Corbyn's cabinet, who's in, who's out, and what Corbynomics is all about, go to our website, channel4.com/news. With me now, Conservative MP Jesse Norman, who served on the Treasury Committee from 2010 until this year. Jesse Norman, you've had a chance to listen to the Shadow Chancellor in his first outing. What do you make? Are you scared?
Well, I think the centre of the British people ought to be very nervous about him and about Mr Corbyn. These are two men from the extreme left, even of the Labour Party. Neither of them know much about economics or finance, and you've got them running the Labour Party and steering it very clearly in a leftward direction.
Although, in fairness, he did run the, John McDonnell did run the GLC Treasury Department, managing a £1 billion budget.
Well, I think that's somewhat different from managing the budget of 1.7 trillion, which is the UK's budget. No, I think it's quite a different matter. And the fact of the matter is that it's not just the people themselves, it's also some of the assumptions they're making. So one of the numbers they have is that they're going to save £120 billion by reclaiming tax. Well, no one in the Treasury thinks you can do more than 30, and the government at the moment has got about 5 or 6 in the numbers. So actually, it's the numbers themselves reflect this lack of experience. And if I was a voter, you know, crying out for an alternative, you know, to represent me, or not necessarily crying out, but at least thinking of one, I think I'd be very unpersuaded by this people.
Well, unpersuaded, but are you at all persuaded by the reality that, of course, the Labour Party has managed to muster hundreds of thousands of people to vote, dwarfing the number of people that ever have anything to do with electing your leader? And that movement, that sense that there are people all over the country who are not very happy about how the way things are, I mean, isn't that democracy?
Well, there's no doubt that there are a number of people in the country, if you look at some of the rallies that you have in Westminster, who feel angry about the way in which the direction of the country is going. But we've just had a general election. Government's been elected. No one was expecting that necessarily, and yet it was a resounding victory. So I think where the centre of the country is pretty clear. And if you look at the people who elected Jeremy Corbyn, of course, those people are by and large not members of the Labour Party. They're people who came in just in order to vote and paid £3 for the privilege.
But some of them are very young. There were people who weren't reaching out to before.
Well, that's terrific, and I think that's very good when young people are excited in politics, and I think you'll find a lot more of them are quietly praying that the government will be allowed to get on with the job it's been given at the general election.
You don't think there's a little bit of a danger for the Tories, who certainly picked up middle class and some working class voting in the last election, that they may be reaching down to the people who voted UKIP and be pulling them aboard?
Well, that's interesting. You can't rule that out. It may be. I'm not sure that's necessarily a threat to the government. It would change the composition of the Labour Party. What I think is more likely is that they're losing vast numbers of kind of middle England voters who weren't persuaded by Ed Miliband and certainly aren't going to be persuaded by Jeremy Corbyn.
But you know, there's a little bit of a sense that maybe the Tories are a bit rattled. I know you haven't seen it, but there is in fact a campaign video that came out today already describing him as the threat and linking him with bin Laden, with, you know, more or less any monster you could find. That sounds a little panicky.
well, I think you can expect a bit of a response when the man's just been elected in a two-party or multi-party democracy. I don't think that's... I think what will really matter is what we see over the next few months by way of policy, and we'll see the response to that.
Jesse Norman, thank you very much for coming in. Well, here we are at the Emmanuel Centre in Westminster, where a gathering of the People's Assembly is awaiting the new Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn. And that, in the end, is tonight's main story. Jeremy Corbyn's first week as Labour leader, along with a new shadow cabinet that's long on rebels but rather short on leading women. A short time ago, our economics editor Paul Mason sat down with Yanis Varoufakis, who served as Greek finance minister for the left-wing Syriza party earlier this year. Paul.
Well, John, Yanis Varoufakis has now left Syriza, the party they came to power with in January, but Syriza, together with the Spanish left party Podemos, equally challenging for power, in fact, in Spain, seem to be part of a general phenomenon that we can see reflected here with Corbyn. Corbyn is a product of a hundreds of thousands of strong vote and movement. And this is something I think has taken the political establishment in Europe by surprise. There's a lot of interest here from the European press. And of course, it's taken political science a little bit by surprise. Varoufakis is one of those people who I think is well qualified to understand what has happened. And of course, Varoufakis studied here, taught here, and has a long engagement with Labour, who he, until very recently, was telling me were a completely useless and irredeemable right-wing party.
But let me hold you for a moment in full flow, because isn't Varoufakis himself discredited? He didn't last the course.
Well, exactly, or rather, they didn't last the course. They would claim, the Greek government, that they were smashed by the coercion of the European Eurozone authorities. He himself claims he was constantly warning his own party and constantly telling them that they should fight harder. Ultimately, I think...
Well, I was right, but I'm not in power. That's hardly victory, is it?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the Greeks, of course, on Sunday have an election where Syriza, the left party, is standing again. Varoufakis told me today he wouldn't vote for them.
Surely his message to John McDonnell, who we spoke to earlier, is stay the course, don't do what I did. I left and I now have no influence.
It's very interesting. To hear from somebody like Varoufakis, who made the journey from social democracy, from the Labour group inside the European Parliament, the party of European socialists, to the far left, on a platform tonight with the Labour leader, this is already breaking the chemistry of the European, as it were, doctrine of parties inside Europe. But Varoufakis, above all, is a voice that has been watching Labour for a while. I think is very interested in what's going on, sees their own failure, and sees what's coming up as another chance, as he told me earlier on. Yanis Varoufakis, you've walked into another hailstorm of political craziness. We've got the furthest left leader Labour has ever had. You met him. What do you think of him?
He's a thoroughly decent person. I think everybody who has ever met Jeremy comes up with that answer. The reason why this hailstorm has happened, of course, is because people all over Europe, and I think in the United States too, at least in part, have had a gutful of this incredible notion that during the good times, finance must take over, and during the bad times, everybody else will have to pay the price for what they've been up to.
As a role model goes, a party that came to power in January, elated, and crashed and burned in July, is not a great role model for Jeremy Corbyn. You'd admit that.
It's a cautionary tale that the exuberance of the first moment has to be managed and has to be channeled into defense mechanisms against the onslaught, which will come from an establishment that is not going to give up its privileges very easily.
What can Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell learn from what you did in office?
The one important lesson is that the people out there, if the message is right, if you are sincere, if you forget about spinning and speak to their heart and address them directly as adults, are not going to be terrorized by the media. Don't fear the media. The media can be bypassed if the message is right and if sincerity defeats hypocrisy.
You, at one point, were very dismissive of Labour, I remember. Mm-hmm. Does this prove a party like Labour can be, in your eyes, redeemed?
Everyone can be redeemed, as long as they do the right thing. Labour lobotomized itself sometime in the 80s and continued to do so. continue to play down its critique of capitalism, of British capitalism. They continue to pretend that it was a light version of the Conservatives, and therefore it ended up being the only political party or organisation in Britain that disowned class struggle.
If Jeremy Corbyn came to you and said, Yanis, help us, would you? On a formal basis?
I don't think they need me. And we all need each other.
Yanis Varoufakis, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yanis Varoufakis talking to Paul Mason earlier. Now, as Jeremy Corbyn settles into his new job, what about people beyond the Labour Party bubble? Is there any more love for their leader out in the country than on Westminster's green benches? Our Home Affairs correspondent Darshana Soni has been to a key Labour marginal, Cannock Chase, in Staffordshire.
I worked till I was 70 cleaning in offices.
But since retiring, Sylvia Parsons says she's given up on politics. Like many one-time Labour voters, she abandoned the party at the last election. So will the new leader make a difference?
Do you know anything about Jeremy Corbyn?
Not a lot, no. Where's he from? Is he English? He is English.
Yeah, he's the new leader of the Labour Party.
Oh, he's elderly.
He's 66.
Yeah.
His supporters may believe Corbyn mania swept the country, but Mrs Parsons is by no means the only person here in Hensford who had never heard of Jeremy Corbyn. In years gone by, this former mining town was safely Labour, but voters like Clive Ridgway feel the party took their votes for granted.
And what about now? Who do you vote for nowadays?
Well, God, be quite honest, I voted for UKIP last time, and my daughter went mad.
They should tell you off.
Yeah.
In fact, nearly 20% of voters here turned to UKIP. Winning them over will be a huge challenge for Mr Corbyn. One man who is all too aware of this is Yanis Toth, the Labour Party candidate. The seat was high on the party's target list in the last election. But although the polls had them 6 points ahead, the Conservatives had a comfortable win.
Do you think realistically, if you had had someone like Jeremy Corbyn as leader, you would have won those votes?
I've got no disrespect for Ed Miliband. He came to Hensford, you know, he's a top-class politician. But what I did hear on the doorstep is that people said there was no difference between the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. In fact, we were in the shadows of the Conservative Party. If Jeremy Corbyn had been leader, or if he is leader in 2020, Cannock Chase will be won by the Labour Party. I'm as confident as that.
Mr Toth admits it'll be hard to counter what he calls the negative press surrounding the new leader. Miranda Hartill has been paying attention to those headlines and feels Jeremy Corbyn has an image problem.
He looks too plain and scruffy. He doesn't look like the type of guy that could run a country. He needs a good shave and a good haircut, and he needs a suit. Can't beat a man in a suit.
Ms Hartill voted Labour under Tony Blair, but then switched to the Tories and says economic credibility is key. Cannock Chase may have suffered the decline of industry, but it's seen a growth in affluent commuter areas. More people, including Tracy Mullis, are also starting up their own businesses.
And so as a business owner, what are your concerns when you come to vote next time? What kinds of things will you be looking at?
Obviously small businesses. We want people that are going to back us up and help us with anything possible that they can do.
And do you think Labour under Jeremy Corbyn will do that?
I hope so. Yeah, let's fingers crossed, let's hope so, yeah.
Jeremy Corbyn isn't the first new leader, of course, to have promised a new kind of politics. Many here say they will wait and see if he really can deliver.
Darshana Soni and Cannock Chase, while we've been on air, the shadow cabinet's been meeting for the first time, and it seems Mr Corbyn has made a gesture towards the establishment. Downing Street said today the Labour leader has accepted an invitation to join the Queen's Privy Council. Well, our political editor Gary Gibbon joins us now from Westminster. More of the Privy Council later, I think. Let's go to where you were in the corridor outside the PLP meeting. Any banging of desks?
Parliamentary Labour Party, other MPs, remember 93% of them didn't vote for Jeremy Corbyn, and boy did they remind him of that as he walked in. Silence, tumbleweed. Normally desk banging, clapping, cheering, nothing of the sort. He walked into silence, and then after he'd done what one described as a rather rambling address, some questions started, and one of the questions particularly provoked a noise which you could hear even in the corridor outside, which was grumbling, chuntering, complaining noises,
Gosh, what do you think
grunting of a
those
kind.
people outside voted for? I mean,
But I can just let me tell you what prompted that, which is that Jeremy Corbyn was asked if he would wear a white poppy. And he gave a long explanation for why it was an important symbol for some people. And at the end of that whole section of his chat, he said about the Cenotaph commemorations on Armistice Day, "I'm not sure what will happen this year." And that is what provoked all those grumblings in the room. There is a real distance between him and the parliamentary party, and of course he's tried to bridge it today by bringing some of them, the new dissidents, the thing that he used to be, into the shadow cabinet. It's going to be incredibly difficult.
So this shadow cabinet, take us through it. 16 women, but none of them in the top jobs, 15 men.
Well, Jeremy Corbyn, and you can see them all around the table here, I think, posing together just a few moments ago, he's emphasising that what is a top job, it's not necessarily the jobs you think that are the top jobs. He's going to put business, which Andrew Eagle has got right at the heart of the administration. There are incredible difficulties here, and you just talk to MPs who've accepted jobs, and they're saying, well, of course we've done that. We've got to let him fail on his own terms and be ready to pick up the pieces and move in when the moment arises. This is not an entirely happy ship. He's going to try and make it a happier one by meeting them halfway, seeking consensus. But consensus is very difficult when one lot are there and the other lot are there.
Gary Gibbon.